This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Hello everyone and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs. I'm Michael Connolly and it is my pleasure, as usual, to be guiding you on this journey of basket casey goodness. So today is a supercharged episode where we've got a massive episode from a session that we ran earlier in the year all about community leasing. So I'm not going to give too much away. I want you to get into the content and have a listen to to what we've got, what we can give you from this episode. But before I do, I want to unpack how we got to this point. So why did we go to the effort of putting a package of information like this together? Now, community leasing is the way that councils lease their land and facilities to community organisations, and I'm particularly interested in sporting groups here because there's a lot of information in this episode about the use of fields and the use of buildings themselves and why we're giving tenure to community groups. That's a really good question and a good starting point. And it's because any community group that wants to make money by running a sport, by running a canteen, by running a bar, should have some form of legal authority to do that. And that's where a lease comes in, a lease, a license, some form of tenure to enable them to be able to do that. But we've seen that a lot of councils get this really wrong. Why do they get it wrong? Now, I'm going to start with one of the great drivers of human behaviour, and that's fear. And it's often the fear at the top level, at the political level, that if we make change, councillors won't get voted back in. Now, in reality, is that the case? Like, even if we've got a sports club with 800 members, we might think that represents 800 voters. Is what happens here going to be that politically connected? Look, I'm not a politician, so maybe I should just bite my tongue. But it seems a little bit senseless to me that we're really making massive decisions about how we're leasing facilities, who we're leasing those facilities to, based on fear of something that might happen or might not happen. So I question that as the basis. And I also think that if councils and councillors don't get this right, the potential backlash could bring them unstuck even further. Like, let's say that we've got one group that's getting special treatment because they're the councillor or the mayor is the patron of this club. So they keep getting special treatment over all of the other clubs in the area. Now, if those other clubs get wind of that, and they say, look, there's local government acts all around the country that prohibit that sort of behaviour, but let's say it gets through somehow, these sweetheart deals that are kind of lingering, particularly with some of the really old tenure instruments that might be 20 or 50 years old. If the other clubs get wind that that's happening, then I think they're right to crack the shits a bit and say, this is not right. You're now setting a precedent. You owe all of us that same level of service. And they're kind of right. I agree that that's right. So what that means is that we've got to have systems. We've got to set a good foundation. And that's what we'll unpack in this episode. Talking about those systems, so many of them are just bad. I think there's a joke, a lot of people talk about going to conferences and it's just bloody death by PowerPoint. You know what? I'm not actually worried about death by PowerPoint. I can sit quite comfortably and fall asleep watching slides all day. You know what really bugs me though? Death by spreadsheets, because somebody new will come into the role and they say, I got a fantastic idea. I'm going to sort all of this out forever. And they reinvent the wheel by making another spreadsheet. And we've got all of these spreadsheets that don't talk to each other. So you've got disparate data sources that aren't working properly. Now, I'm being a bit harsh here because I recognise that some facilities in the country are now, getting up to 150, even older facilities that are still being leased. So there's a lot of legacy. There was not good Wi-Fi 150 years ago, so transmitting an Excel spreadsheet over Wi-Fi didn't work back then. So we've had a lot of changes of systems. A lot of even the enterprise systems that councils use might have changed over time. The customer relationship management databases that they're using, if they're using one, have changed over time. So that's an understandable challenge that they're facing. But there's no excuse for not doing anything about it. So let's actually start to consider what good looks like and then set a system up around that. Even the way that lessees are assessed in their application. So there might be some lessees that have just been here forever. So that's just where they are. They might have been underperforming for, 5, 10, 30 years. And seriously, I know of groups that have been underperforming. There's a lease. It's a legal document. It's registered on the title in many cases. And they're just saying, well, I don't want to do that. I didn't sign it. Yeah, but your organisation signed it. And your organisation is a legal entity and it was signed by your organisation. You are just now the leader of that organisation. That doesn't mean that you don't have to follow the obligations for things like maintenance that it says in the lease. You've got to do that. But then when we assess the eligibility even for groups, it's just poor. We're not digging deep enough, I don't think. Many councils are just seeing this as kind of a set and forget topic. But when they do that, eventually it comes back and it bites them in the bum. So you don't want to just put it down, do it once and then forget about it. Or worse, let's say we issue 10-year leases, just give somebody a 10-year lease and then we don't see them for 10 years. How do we know how they're performing in that time? What are we receiving in terms of reporting that we can assess how they go? Do they need help? Do they need some interventions? Are they doing really well that we could say, hey, let's go and have a look at them and make some case studies about the things that they're doing that we can then let our other lessees know about? We know that things can be better. So that's why we want to fix it. So that's why we've done things like provide this information. And I want everybody to know this stuff because there's so much better that we can do. So have systems, have good systems. Make sure those systems talk to each other. Understand what good looks like. And here I'm talking about good governance, but remember our wheel of governance analogy. Community tenure is just one spoke on that wheel. Well, it probably represents a few because we've got to take into consideration maintenance, capacity, and having a sinking fund. So there's all of the financial stuff that goes into that. But having good systems, having a good understanding of what good governance looks like, and then being able to replicate that good governance, create model behavior, and then incentivize everyone else to follow that good behavior. And then, like I said, it's not set and forget. Provide the sort of support and ongoing training that the transient nature of committees means that the mums and dads who are here now aren't necessarily going to be here in the future. So let's provide the support and the training that they need. So I'm going to leave it now for you to have a listen to the rest of the episode. Big thanks to Jess for putting all of our things, all of our podcasts and everything that we put into those podcasts together. You can follow me at NFP Michael. And of course, if you're not already connected with us at CPR Group, you can jump onto our website, cprgroup.com.au, and sign up for our webinar. Sign up for our webinars and sign up for our newsletter. Enjoy the episode. This has been a really hot topic. We ran this session towards the end of last year and there was quite a bit of demand for us to do it again. So the reason that we've put it earlier in the program this year is largely because a number of councils will be doing their budget planning now. So it's probably a good idea for timing wise to start to think about these sorts of things. So if this can be the catalyst for getting thinking about what you're going to be doing in the area of community leasing over the next year, 2 years, or this current term in office of the current council, then we're very happy to share a lot of information with you. This is, as I said, been a really hot button issue. And at the moment, I don't think anyone's got it right perfectly. So let's go through the session this afternoon and hopefully you'll get a few great ideas and some really good takeaways and practical steps that you can take to improve the way that you're doing community leasing where you are, or if you are a tenant, to improve the way that you're engaging with the council. So we've got quite a range of people joining us. So thank you to those who've said hi in the chat. Hello, Lisa. Good to see you. Louisa, g'day. Ronnie, great. So we've got a really good mix of people from different sorts of organisations. So introduce yourself in the chat. Keep the conversation going there. If there's any questions that you want to pop in or anything really specific that you want to address this afternoon, pop it in there. If we don't get a chance to do that, I promise that we'll follow up with you afterwards, especially if some of those questions do get a little bit specific. But don't wait until I cover the content. Just pop it in there as well, just so that it's captured while you're thinking about it. So before we kick off this afternoon, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the land and waters where you're joining us from, and of course where I'm joining from today. I'm a little bit south of Brisbane here today, so this is Yugambeh country here. It's a beautiful area that kind of goes into the Gold Coast and south of Brisbane and out to the bay over to then Quandamooka country on the beautiful southern Norton Bay Islands and Stradbroke Island. Yes, this is the area that was hit by Tropical Cyclone Alfred a few weeks ago, but we're still here and we're kicking. And we're looking forward to having a discussion about this land because leasing is all about the land where we operate. So where our community centres are, where our sporting facilities are, where our charities operate from, where our universities and our schools are, where our councils work. So it's important that we acknowledge that we are not the first people to have been looking after this land. And while we've got a framework and while we've got policies for the way that we manage community use of community land, this land has been community land for tens of thousands of years, and I think that it's well and truly worthwhile to pay respect to the custodians of that land for well before we got here only a couple of 100 years ago, and to leave it in such great nick for us. And I'd like you to also think about this as a kind of an overarching guiding principle for what we're doing when we're talking about community tenure. It's all about stewardship. and it should all be about long-term stewardship. And what we really want from our leasing policies and the community leasing frameworks that we work on at CPR Group is to make sure that we're providing every opportunity for people at councils, for people at community organisations, clubs, charities, for people in educational institutions to be able to look after the land and maybe even leave it in better shape when they leave than it was when they arrived. So I've got some information that I'd like to share with you through by way of some slides. So I'll share this with you now as we go through the session. But as I said, if you've got questions or if there's anything that you'd like to ask about as we're going through, please feel free to do so. So this is basically what we'll be going through in the session this afternoon. Leasing is, as I said, a bit of a hot button issue. And as we've found out, there's no one size fits all model. But even within each of the models, in each of the municipalities around Australia, there are variations in the type of organisations that we've got. So it is a rich tapestry on both sides of the fence, both on the lessor side of the fence and the lessee side of the fence. So I think it's really important that we have a good understanding of all of those perspectives in community leasing. I'll also be providing what I hope is some really practical steps for you to take. Now, there's some advice for how to set up your leasing frameworks, but more importantly, it's about the approach that you take to community leasing. I think that that's really a really important way for you to be thinking about what the policy looks like, but even maybe more importantly, how you're actually going to implement that policy. So what does the procedure or the implementation framework look like? And I'll also be talking about some common pitfalls that we've seen when we're working with councils and when we're working with clubs and associations on the other side of the fence. So the practical advice and the pitfalls are kind of the opposite sides of the same coin. This is the good thing to do to avoid the bad things. I'll be mixing those in as we go through the session this afternoon. But as I said, any questions that you've got, pop them in the chat as we're going along. So before I get into some of the information about community leasing, there are a couple of points that I'd like to make. And the first one is, how do we know this stuff? Why am I talking to you about this? So we've been doing this type of work for coming up on 3 decades, working with community organisations and with councils on everything from master plans through to educational processes for the mums and dads who are often the reluctant volunteers who are running these community facilities. So we've seen the good, we've seen the bad, and I can promise you we've seen plenty of the ugly. But just because we're seeing ugly, and by ugly here, I'm going to point specifically at ugly data sets. There's plenty of ugly data sets in the way that community leasing is managed in councils, and that's not your fault. Some of the leases that we've got are maybe coming up on 100 years of tenure. Now, the lease itself might not be 100 years old, but I was at a club last night that is celebrating 149 years in business this year. So that means that, as you can imagine, the way that we collect and keep and manage data over the course of that time has changed dramatically. So there's been lots of changes, and it's largely just that we haven't really kept up with the way that we manage data in our councils. And that's okay. But let's draw a line in the sand and say, why is now not the best time to start cleaning it up? And often we find that as we get involved, that's the catalyst for getting things sorted. It's also the catalyst for finding the systems that are missing, the processes that are missing, and that gap between how we want our community tenure framework to work and how it's actually working. And very importantly, how can we close that gap over time and to not make that time an inordinately long amount of time so we can keep it nice and compact. So keep your device with you because I'll be running some polls as we go through this afternoon. And in fact, I'm going to start by running the first poll now. The question that I'd like to ask is, and you can all answer this either from your own perspective as somebody within council or from somebody who's leasing land from council. So the question is there, how strong do you think your council's leadership is in the area of community leasing? So I'm going from, it says 1 to 5, I've actually gone from 0 to 5. Now what I'm looking for here is how you think, so let's use that word leadership. Somebody needs to take a leadership approach, and in most cases it should be councils. So what do you think your council's strength in leadership would be rated on a scale of 0 to 5? It's interesting, I'm watching as the numbers come in, it's pretty balanced here. Nobody said 5 out of 5 yet, but we've got a couple of 4s, which is good. And look, generally speaking, what we find is that the responses here are fair to middling. It's okay, but not fantastic. But what does leadership mean? Leadership means that when it's time to set up a strong leasing policy and a strong leasing framework, we've got a council approach that will do that and things will be done well. But the opposite can be that a weak leadership approach is when challenges arise, the councils often take a back step and say, well, we don't really want to be getting our hands too dirty here, or we don't really want to be held to account, so we'll just push it down the road, or we'll not make a decision. Let me show you now how these have come in. So you can see, like normal, the answers have pretty much resolved themselves into a bit of a bell curve here. So you've got 3 people have said 4, so that's great, well done. There's a 0 in there, but plenty of 1s, 2s, and mostly 3s. So room for improvement is how I'm going to interpret that. But as I said, that's okay. The fact that you're here, or the fact that you're watching this recording later on, means that you have some level of interest in wanting to make things better. And that is absolutely the first step. So let's jump in. As I said, a couple of things I wanted to touch on. That was the first one. The second one is the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that community leasing can be incredibly political. So much so that community leasing we have seen become a political football around election time. That's just the nature of the beast, and it would be naive of me to think that anything that I say is going to change that. But to point it out very clearly, I'm on the outside. So when it comes time to point at some of the things that I think councils don't do particularly well, and as I've just done, that can be largely in the area of leadership in this area, that we sometimes just kick the can or the problem down the road, or we don't stop and say, well, actually, we could do something more serious and just stick a band-aid on this problem by, and some of the jobs that we've been brought in to do, from mediation through to organizational development, rather than just saying, hey, this is actually an issue, we need to fix it up. We had a lease with a commercial operator that extended beyond the term of the lease to the club that leased that facility. Now, instead of just saying that commercial lease can't be enforced, we were brought in to kind of say, well, is there something that we can do to fix it? In fact, this has happened a number of times. Is there something that we can do that doesn't actually address the problem, but it just kind of puts a band-aid on it, or makes it go away, or makes it worse, go beyond the next election cycle? So we don't want to see that happen. We see politicians getting involved, and I'll be very careful in how I choose my words here. We see politicians getting involved in community leasing often because, let's take a big football club. Now, depending on where you are in the country, that can be round ball football if we're down south, or egg-shaped football if we go further north, or right down south. But take a football club that's got 1,000 playing members. Now, that's a decent-sized club, not the largest in the world, but a decent-sized club. To a councillor, that can mean the difference between getting elected again and not getting elected again. And so often they will bend over backwards to do not what's right, but what they perceive to be right. Sometimes their level of engagement with those clubs is superficial at best, and all they're seeing is, 1,000 playing members. That could be, mum and dad, maybe an adult child and a grandparent here and a grandparent there. That could be 5,000 potential votes if I do what I think is right for that club. When in reality, what they're doing is just holding that club back, or holding back our ability to do what's right in this sector. So what I want you to do is to take an approach that says we need to transcend terms. Now, transcending terms means transcending the terms of the current lease. So if your leasing policy is 4 years, 5 years, 10 years max, then we need to be thinking, as I said, about stewardship. So we want to be doing right for the long, long term. But it also needs to be beyond the term in office for the current elected officials, our councillors and our mayors. Because if we're only thinking about the current 4-year cycle, then we're only going to be doing what I think is best now. But great projects very, very often take longer than 4 years. Let's just take the Olympics, for instance. We've still got more than a 4-year runway, and we're falling behind in some areas in our planning. So we need to be thinking longer term than just a term in office. But it goes even deeper, because the political nature of the elephant in the room here goes beyond just the councillors. It's also the political nature of our committees. So we have some fiefdoms being built in clubs where we have presidents that want to leave their legacy, not a great legacy for the community, but they want their copper pressing or their portrait or their sculpted bust in the clubhouse. It's got to be bigger than any individual. We've got to take, as I said, a stewardship approach for the long term. That's really, really important. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the session this afternoon. So the landscape of community leasing has a lot of players. Let's start with clubs and community organisations. So there's a lot of different types of facilities that are leased to these community groups. So we've got sports clubs, we've got community organisations, we've got charities, we've got welfare organisations, we've got homelessness support groups, we've got women's shelters, we've got men's sheds. The list is very, very long. We've got show grounds and show societies. So the list is very long of the types of groups and the types of facilities that are leased to these groups. And obviously the other side of the relationship is then council. And when we're looking at who in council leasing, community tenure or community leasing touches, it goes really, really deep. So we've got property and engineering, and I'll touch on that a little bit as we move on as well. But working on both sides of the fence, a lot of the work that we do is directly with clubs now, whether that's direct work with clubs or through a peak body to help them with strategic planning, with governance, with facility planning, with finding money, with diversification of revenue streams. We've been doing that for almost 30 years. So in that time, we've seen what makes a great club tick, but we've also seen what makes poor clubs emerge from great clubs. On the council side of the fence, we also see that sometimes there might be a new greenfield site developed, and from often the political side of the fence, but even the official side of the fence, so the bureaucracy of council, we say, well, we'll just put that into the leasing portfolio and we'll lease it out, and then it's done, and we can just wash our hands of it. But hang on, we're talking about millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, and the question is, are our sometimes reluctant mums and dads on committees the best people to be running those facilities? And is our structure the right way to be doing it? Let me take a step up, not necessarily a step back, but a step up, and to say, why do we do community leasing? The question about why we do community leasing is really one of going to the corporate plan or the council plan to say, when we are looking at council's purpose and we're looking at what we're trying to do as a council in the community, there'll be something in there that says something like, we want to create an active, healthy, engaged and connected community. And I'm going to put that right up on a pedestal and say, we don't do leasing because we want to have good contracts. We don't do leasing because we want to wrap somebody over the knuckle for not meeting their maintenance obligations as spelled out in the lease. We do community leasing because we want our spaces to be active, to be activated, so that they are creating an active, healthy, engaged and connected community. Our community. That's why we do it. So keep that in mind as to when we're talking about this relationship between the lessor and the lessee, that's why we do it. So let's keep that in mind as we move on. So what do we think the key elements of a successful leasing program are? Well, let's start here. I think that the keys to success start with having very clear understandings of everybody's roles. So what we mean here is by understanding that we've got a whole heap of maintenance obligations just to start with. We've got activation obligations to start with. So we need to have those very clearly spelled out. Who has to do what to meet the lease obligation? So as lessors, councils will have obligations, and as lessees, clubs and community organisations will have obligations. And it's important that they are spelled out really, really clearly. The reason that they need to be spelled out really, really clearly is because at some point we get to committee handovers. And as I said, it's often reluctant mums and dads who take the reins and become leaders in our community organisations. And committee handovers are lackluster at best in our experience, and they very, very rarely include any detail about the lease or about facility maintenance obligations. So it's important that they are included. So the other thing here is that the incoming committee members very rarely bring a whole heap of skills or expertise in even good governance, but especially not necessarily more sophisticated asset management expertise or leasing compliance obligations. So it's important that they are very clearly spelled out so that when all of us are engaging with lessees, or when us as lessees are engaging with council, we know to ask these questions. Can you point out to me where are the obligations that we as a club need to be adhering to? Or from a council perspective, in your engagement with clubs, reminding them of their obligations, but to be doing so in a supportive way rather than an enforcement wrap over the knuckles kind of way. So we also get to a point where there's a lot of departments that get involved in community leasing. So when you think about this, we've got the area of communities, we've got sport and recreation, we've got property, we've got buildings and facilities, we've got asset management, we've got our maintenance. I'm going to run out of fingers here. We've got engineering, we've got legal, we've got governance because they actually write the policies. I'm going to stop there. There's two handful of fingers of different departments. And unfortunately, what we see when we get involved in these projects very often is that there's a lot of silos going on here. And the cross collaboration between those silos can be quite limited. Everyone's got their own KPIs, fine, but how do we link them together? Because this is really, really important because inside council, if we can't get it right here, then from a customer services perspective, which would mean that I'd need to lift up a foot because I've run out of fingers already, then from a customer services perspective, how good does that reflect on our council, our brand, to our community? So I think that it's really important that we have that clarity. Now, when I'm talking here about interdepartmental communication, please, please, please avoid the temptation to take the easy way out and just fire off an email. It frustrates me so much when I follow up with somebody, and I will pick up my phone and I will follow up and say, hi, how is that process going? Because let's just say that I need something from asset management. Working with the communities team, need something from asset management, and they've undertaken to follow up on that. And they say, oh yeah, I fired off an email a couple of weeks ago. I haven't heard anything. They work down the freaking corridor. Please get up. Go and see them. Go and build relationships across the silos within council, because the more you know people and the better relationships you have with people in other departments, the better community service you will be able to deliver. It's all about long-term stewardship. So if you can build those relationships by avoiding email and going and meeting people and making friends, then when you need something, they will be willing to help. When they need something, you will be willing to help. And why? Because we're trying to create active, healthy, engaged, and connected communities. And that can be the job of the officers within councils. I mentioned data systems before. Now, robust systems and processes, of course, data comes into that, but it's really only one part of it. How are you keeping track of the communications that you've had? Very often we've seen disconnected or disparate data sets that are trying to play the role of a customer relationship management database or a CRM, when they don't, because somebody will have their own way of putting things into it. Somebody will go and send several emails or make several phone calls, have several meetings with tenants, and none of that information is captured. So the history of communication becomes really, really important. So CRM is there. Data management is really, really important. Don't kick yourself if your data's not good. Let's just use this as a line in the sand. When we help you to fix it, let's use that as the line in the sand to say, okay, so let's get the data up to date, and then let's find the best system to put that in. Some of the enterprise software systems that councils are using have property modules built into them. Unfortunately, we see a lot of times they're not turned on because they're not part of the subscription. That means manual processes. Manual processes mean human intervention. Human intervention, not that I'm being nasty here, means opportunity for mistakes to be made or things to be missed. So we want to be reducing those. So those three things I think are absolutely key to having great community tenure programs or a good approach to community tenure. So how do we get there? Well, let's start at the top. And I do like here to engage with the elected officials, because ultimately if they'll be the ones making the decisions, then let's engage them as early in the process as we can. And I call it the philosophy that council wants to take here, recognizing that it's not necessarily a philosophy from a philosophical definition perspective. But what we're talking about is where do our elected officials want to position our council on a continuum that runs from one end, cost recovery, through to the other end, a really strong community services obligation approach. So that creates the continuum that we're talking about here. So what does that mean? So cost recovery at this end of the continuum would mean that we're focusing on recouping a proportion of costs. So we want to make some money to cover the fact that we have invested in the infrastructure to begin with, but also that there may be maintenance obligations. There will always be maintenance obligations that the council has. And there is always the risk that the council wears, the reputation risk, the usage risk, the physical risk, the financial risk of having that facility accessed by the community. So the flip side of that is then going the other way and saying, well, let's take a fully or heavily subsidized approach where we're saying this is our community service obligation. We want to be just giving things away to the community where council does everything. So on a high cost recovery model, council does very little or spends very little. On a community service obligation approach, council will do a lot and spend a lot. Now, it's a continuum. It's not a dichotomy, it's a continuum. So it's important. The philosophy is about saying, where do we want to sit here? So what's most important to us as elected officials when we're making up our mind about how we want to be sitting on this continuum? It's up to councils then to use that. The second point there is balancing the sustainability with community accessibility. So really what that means is that I'm not talking sustainability here about environmental sustainability as much as I am about financial sustainability. So we need the community to be able to access and activate our facilities, but we also need to understand where the money's coming from and how that can be sustainable. So for any of our regular viewers, you'll know that what we bang on at CPR Group about all the time is that I want clubs to run great businesses. I want clubs to have great financial capacity themselves so that they can be doing a really good job in serving their community. So we're bringing in enough money so that we can be providing fantastic facilities. Remembering that not-for-profit doesn't mean they're not allowed to make a profit. It just means that any profits that they make, which is income over expenses, it's that gap that they will then be able to reinvest in things like facility renewals, facility upgrades. So that's what we want. So profit is where growth lives, is what I often say. So we really want them to be investing and having an entrepreneurial mindset. But then what's council's role there as well? So where's the money coming from and who's paying for it? And again, that comes down to where on that continuum we're positioned. And before I move on, I just want to touch on this concept of peppercorn rental and what that means. So you've no doubt heard that term, but what does it actually mean? Well, peppercorn rental, we don't actually charge a peppercorn, but in the old days we could have, because as I understand, pepper was quite a valuable commodity. People sailed around the world to find spices. And so a peppercorn was a valuable consideration. And that's what it comes down to. In legal contracts, or for a contract to be legally binding, there needs to be what's called valuable consideration given from both sides. So if council is leasing a facility, then that's valuable consideration because that facility is an asset and it has a significant value. So it's the land value, it's the services value, it's the facilities value. So what assets have we constructed on the asset of the land itself? So we can't then, for it to be a legally binding contract, we can't then say, well, you can have it for free. There needs to be something. So often peppercorn rental is written into leases as something like $1 per year if collected. So that means that they still need to, because a dollar is valuable consideration, it's still money. Now, again, we don't do that because we want to be giving stuff away for free. We do that largely because of where we see ourselves on this continuum, but remember why we're doing this in the first place. We're not doing it because we want to just say, oh, we want to do everything because we love our community. No, we want to so if the council chooses the community service obligation end of the spectrum, we want to be providing great support for our community organisations because they do a great job in providing support to our community, and it's support that we want. We want them to be providing sporting facilities and sporting opportunities. We want them to be providing community services. We want them to be providing support to groups that are in need, to cohorts of people who are in need. So we want that, so that's how we support them, because again, it's all about this active, healthy, engaged, connected community. That's what it's about, so that's why we do it. Okay, so jumping on, now let's talk about the different types of tenure arrangements, and there is quite broad diversity in these. So I'm creating a couple of continuums here, if continuums is the correct plural for continuum. So let's have a look at a continuum here that moves kind of from a fixed approach to a more flexible approach. And that's why I like to refer to it as community tenure more broadly, rather than just community leasing, because it's often not just community leasing. The ways that our communities access buildings and facilities, so built infrastructure that has exclusive use, so it's locked up, it's fenced, it's a building, then that's often by way of lease, a lease agreement, which is a formal agreement down this end of the spectrum, at the more of the fixed end of the spectrum. So a lease agreement is formal because it's actually registered on the title. And technically, if council leases land to a community organisation, council is divesting itself of that land for the term of the lease. So very often what happens is because it's a lease agreement, that asset comes off the council's asset register. The question then is, does it go onto the asset register of the community organisation? Does the community organisation even have an asset register? So that's really important. That's a legally binding contract registered on the title itself. It can also then include subleases. So a sublease might be, let's say we've got a shared facility, and we'll take the Victorian model where we've got a lot of AFL clubs that are shared by cricket clubs, winter, summer. Instead of having both of those parties joint parties to a lease for the entire year, often we'll have a head lessee, so maybe the AFL club will take the lease and then sublease to the cricket club. Again, a sublease is registered on the title, so it's a legally binding and enforceable lease and quite fixed. So it gives surety of tenure to both groups, even though there is a subordinate nature of a sublease to a lease. Then we've got our right of use agreement. So right of use agreement might also be a permit, a license to occupy, a permit to occupy. They can have different names. Now there's less exclusivity in these sometimes as well, because sometimes a right of use agreement might be for certain days or even certain hours on certain days. And often we see right of use agreements for field spaces, for open spaces. So a sporting club, for instance, might have a right of use agreement for the time that they're actually running their training and games. But when they're not there, then the community can still access that space because it's not exclusively for that club to use those facilities. A permit to occupy can be very similar, and again, for often for spaces that aren't exclusive use spaces, so for shared spaces. When we get into a management agreement, often we see these for things like community centres. So community centres are often run by council staff. So some of them are run by council staff. They're a council venue. So if I go and hire a space in a community centre, the onboarding and the induction program and the safety program I have to go through and using that space is exactly the same as it would be if I was using a room in the council's building, the council's admin building, or even council chambers. But sometimes councils almost outsource the operation of community centres to community centre associations. And if it's not by way of lease, it's by way of a management agreement. And sometimes the fees actually go the other way. So whereas a lease fee is usually paid by the lessee to the council, a management agreement fee might be paid from council to the managing entity. And we certainly see that when we talk about commerciality. So for things like swimming pools, sometimes the relationship is that the swimming pool operator is actually paid a fee by council, and then council has maintenance obligations as well. So that's what a management agreement is and how it can differ. And then we get right down the other end where we've got seasonal bookings. Now, seasonal booking might not even be for a full year. It might just be for that part of the year that our sport, for instance, is active. And so it's just for maybe 6 or 7 months that we're active there. But it provides more surety than just it being a day by day. Can we use it this day? Can we use it this day? More on a seasonal basis. So I've just noticed that Angela's popped a comment in the chat here. Our council has more license agreements rather than leases for our sporting clubs that share facilities as they are non-exclusive. That's great, Angela. So yeah, that's a really, really good point. That it gives you more flexibility or adaptability in the model, and that's great for when there are facilities that are shared. Sorry, there's one more that I wanted to mention before we move on, and that is that we can also have more of a sophisticated model where we might have an entity, so we might have a head lease and a head lessee that is an entity that is actually different from the user groups of the facility. Now, this can be good for separate, and the example that I'll use here is hockey. Hockey uses really expensive facilities. So, we're getting a bit better from an environmental sustainability perspective, but a synthetic hockey field, only as recently as 15 years ago, you've got to fill it up with lots and lots of water and it wears out. So it's synthetic turf that wears out. It might have a lifespan of about 10 years. So that means that if we want our hockey association to be viable beyond 10 years, we've got to have a process in place for replacing that turf. So that means that we've got to be saving up enough money, because if we don't get a grant, it's still going to need to be replaced. And if we want to play hockey the next year, we're going to need a new turf. So we've got to have a way to do that. And what we've found is that there were some hockey associations that, in the interests of keeping fees down, weren't charging enough money to have anything stored in what we call the sinking fund, which is that money that we're putting aside to replace the turf in 10 years. And they really got themselves into pardon the pun, hot water in that case. So by separating it out and saying, well, let's rather than lease the facility to the sporting entity themselves, let's create a facility managing entity whose job it is to manage facilities. So then they create the charging structures to the Hockey Association and any others who use those facilities, so that we're making sure that the business model here means that the facility will remain active, so that we're creating an active, healthy, engaged, connected community. So let's now move on to what other considerations we've got in community leasing. The first one I've got here is commerciality, and this runs pretty deep. So I mentioned the swimming pool example. So that's already happening. We've got commercial entities that are running community facilities already. But how much further can this go, and how much further should it go? So you no doubt have come across professional private trainers in parks running boot camps or PT sessions in a park. Now, are those people paying for that use, or are they just in effect stealing access to space to run a commercial activity? You'll have market stalls, you'll have community events, but even the community organisations themselves have an element of commerciality. They're businesses, they need to run good businesses, and that means they're charging membership fees, they're running a canteen, maybe even running a bar. So let's now take that to the next level and say, well, what if this licensed venue is actually gaming licensed and liquor licensed, and then in effect in competition with all of the pubs in town? So not only the other clubs, but all of the pubs in town. How do we make that fair? How do we make sure that council's not giving a unfair free access to some organisation who's then in competition with others? So that's why the model needs to take into consideration how we're charging. So that's why I mentioned charging models there. When you're looking at charging models, it's not just a matter of thinking about how much are we charging in lease fees. We need to look at this holistically and say there will be some element of maintenance responsibility put onto the lessee. So what are we expecting them to pay or to contribute to the maintenance? And then that goes into their overall cost. Even though it's not necessarily fees paid directly to council, it still needs to be considered in the overall charging model. The spanner in the works here, though, and it's almost still a taboo topic, is a question about who is the best organisation to properly activate our community infrastructure. For decades, it's been, and many policies that we've worked on over many years have basically said, we need to lease our community infrastructure to community organisations. A community organisation means that you've got to be not-for-profit, which means you've got to be an incorporated association, a company limited by guarantee. But one way or another, you can't distribute any surplus among your members. It all needs to go back into your operation as a community organisation. Fine, but what's the level of sophistication of these groups? Some of them are really good. Those some are very few though. You know, they're at the pointy end of a bell curve. The majority of the groups in the middle, as I said before, they don't bring, the volunteers who lead these organisations don't bring a great deal of expertise in governance, in running good businesses, or in asset management. And all of those three things are exactly what we need to be properly activating these spaces. So how long will it be before, instead of saying, well, we need to have some model where we've got a community organisation is always the head tenant, and then we've got some element of commerciality that we kind of just sweep under the rug? I'm saying let's shine a spotlight on it and see how we can maximise the value that our community, remembering it's all about our community, what's the value that our community can get out of activating spaces, even including commercial organisations? So that could be a commercial academy that's coming and activating spaces in holidays or every single week. It could be the things that we run out of the clubhouse, so extra facility hiring that it makes the facility available to more sorts of community organisations. It could be events that we're running. So there's lots of opportunities when we open that door up. And I'm going to single out tennis here because tennis is often a complicated beast. And we've got some councils that say we must lease it to a community organisation. But being a tennis dad, I know full well that tennis is a different sport than when I was a soccer dad. When I was a soccer dad, it was okay for me to get in and have a go at coaching. I did my coaching certificate and I really enjoyed it. I loved helping the kids get better at soccer. There's no way I could do that with tennis. We couldn't do it with golf. I couldn't do it with gymnastics. I couldn't do it with swimming. And it's often these individual sports where there is just an acceptance that this is commercial. We have to have commercial people running these programs. But why do we need to create this really awkward structure? We're saying, well, all the money's got to go through the club and then they can pay the pro, but we've got to have this agreement in place that we're making it too complicated. We've got to accept that maybe a lease directly to a commercial operator in this, and I'm not trying to break any new ground here. We already do this with some facilities like swimming pools. We're going to need to open the way that we think to bring that into the future of community leasing as well. This is possibly another elephant in the room, and that's there's always going to be conflict when it comes to community leasing. Excuse me. Often that conflict is around shared use of facilities. And it can get quite ugly. We've seen some pretty ordinary sorts of behavior around sharing of facilities. And let's not back away from the fact that conflict in community leasing is going to happen. It does happen. It's going to continue to happen. Let's deal with it. But let's deal with it. Let's try and manage that conflict as effectively as we can. Now, I believe that it's when two parties are negotiating to go into an agreement that they should be starting to talk about the things that could bring this agreement unstuck or make things start to unravel. It's exactly the same as a job interview. You don't go into a new job without trying to get a good feel for fit. Is this going to be a good relationship? Certainly a marriage. We go on dates before we get married so we get to know each other well, so we can see if we will be a fit. I think that it's really important that we take an approach that enables us to make sure that there is a fit, but also to make sure that all of the parameters around the things where we may have fights in the future are all nice and clear right up front. So we've seen fights arise because things aren't in a leasing policy. So I think that, and look, there's a good old saying, the best day to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best day is today. So by that, I mean, if you've got a leasing policy that doesn't address everything where you're now having conflicts, okay, you can't go back in time and fix it, but we can fix it from today. So we can deal as best as we can with those ongoing conflicts, but we need to stop any more happening by getting in and fixing anything that's broken. So fixing the policy, fixing the implementation framework for that policy as well. So this whole part about conflict is a much bigger session, and it's certainly become a very common and popular session for our council clients, our student association clients, our peak body clients to engage us to come and run this program. And ideally, it's actually a multi-day program. But I did want to give you a snapshot of how we approach conflict management in our program. And really, it's about looking for win-win scenarios. So what can we do to make sure that every party is going to get out of this the best outcome? So if we use this guiding principle of trying to create active spaces that create an active, healthy, engaged, and connected community, then we're all trying to achieve that. That puts us all on the same page. Let's go into any negotiation that we have looking at that and how can we both play our part. So looking for a win-win scenario. That's when we have high concern for our own party, but also high concern for the other party. So it's all about remembering why we do leasing. It's not just to have a good contract. It's not just to have no fights. It's this. It's for our community outcomes. So there are some things that we can use, and I've got it in there, the objective standard. So what can we look for to say, look, these are the rules, they're in black and white, let's make sure we're getting them right. And so from a legal perspective, we've got land acts, we've got local government acts, we've got work health and safety acts, we've got privacy legislation, we've got safety protocols. There's a lot that goes into legislation. That means, well, we've got to comply with all of that. So that does give us a good starting point. But the policy and the framework itself should provide even more detail. So a little bit of if then. So if these situations arise, then this is how we will deal with it. So some scenario planning. But as I talk about in a moment, if we get the principles of agreement right at the top level, then a lot of this a lot of the detail, the how-to, will then fall out of that because we're staying on the same page and we're keeping the big picture in mind. By having an objective standard, which is a solid leasing policy, it also means that we can have consistency. Consistency means that we're not, and this goes right back to the elephant in the room, we're not making a special deal just because if we get the votes of those 5,000 people, I get re-elected. We're having consistency that says what is right for, and by the way, I've also seen situations where councillors go and interfere, and I'm going to use that word quite strongly. They go and interfere with community leasing, thinking that it's going to get them re-elected, and all it does is make them enemies because they think that by saying, "Oh no, we're going to pay for their water and their electricity and even their internet connection. Right? We're going to pay for that." But based on what? Like, there's no policy that says that you can do that. You're just doing that to try and get re-elected. And then the backlash from all of the 19 other clubs that play the same sport that didn't get that support come back to the council, and then council has to wear it and go and fix it. And going with their tail between their legs and saying sorry means that there's not a good chance that they're going to have to, well, maybe, it's politics after all, but at least they look like they've got egg on their face. And I want to then touch here on what's really important, which is the fact that we have high volunteer turnover. So there's a need for ongoing support from councils. Councils need to understand that the mums and dads who are here today are different from the ones who were here this time last year. And they're different. Look, the percentage varies from year to year, but if we look at the rate of volunteering at being now statistically less than 20%, then we can assume that 4 out of 5 volunteers who are on a committee today will be gone. So maybe only one person in a committee of 5 will still be here this time next year. That's a lot of turnover. So it means that the sorts of support that councils provide to their community organisations needs to be more than just giving them access to facilities and forgetting about it and saying, see you in 10 years. It's about what sort of support do you need? So that's support in making sure that the facilities are in good order and are active, and that we can teach you what we know about facility planning and facility activation. Do they have diverse revenue streams? And did they know about how to read financial statements? Do they know about how to protect themselves from fraud? Because if they're making more money and they're investing those back in the facilities, we're achieving our desired result. Do they have the right approach to people? Is a full volunteer model right for the future? Are we having the right sorts of approaches to marketing, to be getting people in to even know that we exist? How many times have you heard of people walking into a facility for the first time saying, "I never knew this place existed. I've lived here for 40 years and driven past 1,000 times and never knew this place existed, or that you guys did this sort of work." We're going to get rid of that. So we're going to have great approaches to marketing, all about the people. So facilities, money, people, and the final core pillar here is governance. And it's more than just a good constitution. It's understanding, what does our organizational structure look like? What does our legal structure look like? And what are all of the systems and processes that our community organizations need to run and need to be transferable, so that when all of these new volunteers come in, they've got systems to be able to pick up and they're not reinventing the wheel every single time. So I'm going to throw it open to another poll now. And I'm going to ask you the question, how would you rate your council's support for your, what have I said there, clubs? So for clubs, I'm thinking here of community organisations, charities, so anyone who would be a lessee, what sort of support, or how would you rate the quality of the support or the level of support that your council is giving to those organisations? Again, it goes from 0 to 5, with 0 being really, really terrible and 5 being absolutely awesome. What do you think? Okay, so the answers are starting to roll in, and this is probably a little better. I've got a few more 4s rolling in already, which is good. That's great. So think about what that support looks like. Is it face-to-face hand-holding support for individual organisations? Is it workshops that you're providing? Do you provide them access to resources? So similar to the resources that we developed for the Queensland government, the Club IQ resources. If you haven't had a look at those, make sure you do, because they're fantastic. The great resource that's available for even those interstate, go and have a look. It's all freely available. And what we wanted to do when we put that information together was not just create, when we're talking about here, I'll show you how these have gone. It's not just about saying, these are the 12 attributes of an effective president. It was more, well, what does the president need to know? And what does the president need to feel? And how does the president need to behave? So it was digging deeper than just the superficial stuff. And that's really what we've tried to include in there. But that can be the sort of support that instantly you can be providing to your community organisations to help them run better businesses. So that's much better. I'm glad to see that there are no 0s here. Okay, so finally, how do we develop a strong community leasing framework? And I'm going to suggest here that the best way to do this is to take what I call a principle-based approach, which is where we want to have good principles. So we've got now the guiding beacon, our North Star says that we want to activate our community spaces and we want to have an active, healthy, engaged, and connected community. So to do that, when we're building a framework, I like the idea of agreeing on a handful of principles. If you get to more than 10, it's too many because you're then starting to whittle some away. So focus on the principles that you think are the most important. And I've put 5 here as an example. So let's start with risk. And I've put risk as number 1 because risk goes very deep. Councils wear risk, financial risk, reputational risk, legal risk, physical risk. If a facility fails because of maintenance not being done and people are hurt, then it's going to be nasty, especially if somebody is killed and the coroner gets involved, then we're going to find out that there were shortcomings. So let's not find those out because somebody is hurt or killed. Let's make sure that we have a risk-based approach that says we need to keep our community safe. So above all of that is don't hurt anyone, do no harm. And then we get to equity. Now, equity does not necessarily mean equality because some of our community organisations make a lot of money. And for me, great, that's really good. Some charities are, we work with many multi-million-dollar charities. They're great businesses. A lot of them face the same issues as the small $20,000 community organisation, but they're a very big organisation. What do they need and what can they contribute? So this also goes back to, say, the licensing. Do they have a gaming license? And is gaming licensing where councils want to be providing facilities? Or do councils want to provide facilities for activity, health, engagement, and connection? We might then say, okay, well, if they're making money, these clubs with gaming license, and I've got no problem with them making money, but if they're making money from something that's not necessarily a core business of council, is that a reason to say equitably we can divert funds away from them and over to them? It's not necessarily a Robin Hood approach, but it's definitely saying we need to be equitable in the way we're providing our services. And then we get into simplicity. So my old accountant, Graham, used to say, if it's too complex to sketch out on the back of an envelope, you need to simplify it. So make sure that it's simple. And sometimes you'll find as you work around the principles that in increasing the score of one principle, you are decreasing the score of another. And often it's equity and simplicity. So if we try and make it really, really equitable, it can mean that the management of that system becomes too onerous on not only the community groups, but certainly the staff in council who are having to do the day-to-day management of our leases, especially our lease applications and our lease renewals. Sustainability is, okay, it does touch on environmental sustainability and the ability for these facilities to be able to do what they do for the long term, but it's also about financial sustainability. And that's what role does each party to the lease play in funding what it costs to keep that facility up and running. And then there's adaptability. Things don't stay the same. There are sports that are popular today, pickleball, for instance, that were not heard of in a day. I'll go back 30 years, for instance, when sports like squash were doing much better than they are today. So times change. We need to make sure that our tenure policies and our frameworks have enough adaptability in them to be able to ride with the times, and recognize also that that means we've got changing times when it comes to the way that our volunteers are involved. Will the volunteer only model of community organisations still be exactly the same in 5 or 10 years' time? And finally, this is not set and forget. It's all about making sure that we've got strong people, great governance, and good communication. So what do I mean by that? In a nutshell, it means that we've got to understand that we've got people on the council side and they need training. So that's, again, if the more that people in councils know what we know, then the better connected they are to their ability to deliver great outcomes with their community organisations and support and guide their community organisations to be able to do a great job. But it also then recognises on the other side of the fence that the people who are here today, 4 out of 5 of them are likely to not be here next year. So we need to be continually working with the people on the other side of the fence to make sure that they are connected and they understand what's required of them. When we talk about governance, that's the systems and processes. So again, we've got the systems and processes for community leasing inside council and the systems and processes that our community organisations need to be able to activate these spaces. And when I talk about communication, again, please communicate personally. I understand the difficulties in scale of communicating personally because you can only have one conversation at a time. But the more personal you can make your communication, which means you can back it up with email, but don't use email as your go-to. Use the phone, use in face-to-face interactions, get to know people, because then they will feel heard. And this is from both sides of the fence. So communicate really, really well and stay connected. Volunteers bring amazing passion. They bring amazing vision, but they don't necessarily bring the skills and experience that is required to put all of that into practice. So if we've got people in councils who are well trained, perhaps by taking part in one of our training programs, they know what they need to do, they know about governance, they know about community organisations, and they can provide the right levels of support, and then they can communicate those with their community organisations. Everyone does better, and we achieve this. So I'd like to wrap up then just with a quick note about what the future can look like. As I mentioned, commerciality is one thing that I think needs to be better considered by councils than it has been to date. Now, that doesn't mean that we go away from the community tenure model and just take a pure commercial leasing approach, but it does mean we need to have a good hard look at ourselves and say, are the mums and dads who are the reluctant volunteers running our community organisations in the best position to be activating our spaces to achieve our desired result? If the answer is yes, great, but keep monitoring it. That's the adaptability principle. If the answer is no, then the next question is, well, what can we do differently? But I'd also like to bring up another topic that is, again, certainly the topic of more detailed conversation. And it's the fact that I think that the way that we've got, especially in sport, the federated model of support, I think has run its day. We no longer need a massive tier that in the old days, we had the national body communicated with the states, and the states communicated with the regions, and the regions communicated with the zones, and the zones communicated with the club. And you get this massive pyramid because everyone had to go to the post office to collect their mail every week. Now, if the national body puts out a communique, it goes out EDM, social media, on their website, it's done. Everybody gets it straight away. So from a communication perspective, it's actually more efficient if the top is communicating directly with everyone who are the participants. But what can we do to eliminate a lot of the duplication and waste that exists in our system? Now, in many of your councils, there are a number of clubs that are very similar, and in effect, they're in competition to each other. Competition on the field, fine. But do we need to be taking that competition off the field? Because they're also then competing for volunteers and they're competing for talent. So if we've got, say, 10 clubs, all of the same sport, we need 10 incorporated associations, 10 presidents, 10 vice presidents, 10 public officers, 10 secretaries, 10 treasurers, 10 lots of financial reports, 10 lots of annual reporting, 10 lots of different levels of insurances, and you can see the waste goes on and on and on. It's duplication. Could we consolidate? Are there opportunities where we have, and we're working on many different options here with a number of sports, that really opens up the idea of, well, we could be creating hub models that actually work because we're properly resourcing them. We've seen a lot of hub models not work, where you've got a management committee that it manages the whole sporting precinct, that management committee is just made up of representatives from each of these clubs, and then it disbands because all of these representatives say, I don't want to go to another meeting. So it wasn't properly resourced. Can we properly resource it so we can actually keep exactly the same number of teams, exactly the same number of competitions, that just reduce the bureaucracy, reduce the duplication, and even include that in the future of our community tenure model? That is something that, it's a discussion we are now having much more actively, and it's one that I would be very happy to have with all of you, especially if it touches a nerve, especially if you've said, oh, I'm not comfortable with that. There's something in what Michael's saying here that I don't like. Then you are exactly the person that I want to talk to. Are we missing something? Is there something that you know that we don't? Because we need to include that in our model as we are planning for the future, not only the future of community tenure, but the future of community organisations in general. What's the best way to get the best bang for time? Not bang for buck, but bang for volunteer time. So to wrap up, there are 4 very simple things that I want you to remember. Start with philosophy. Where do we want to sit on this continuum of cost recovery versus community service obligation? What are the principles? Try and keep it to a handful, 6 at a pinch. You don't need too many because they then form the more of the guiding path to get to this North Star. Then it's not only the policy, it's also the framework. So the policy is obviously the high level position, but they should be quite simple. Most of your policies will probably be quite short, but then it's going to need the important parts all built into the community tenure framework. And finally, it's not set and forget. There's ongoing education and support that we all need to be providing to our clubs, associations, charities, community organisations of all shapes, right across the spectrum. So I hope that you've got a lot of value out of today's session. There's a little give there in our podcast, Basket Case Club. So you can find that on our website at cprgroup.com.au or on Spotify, Google, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. The reason I want to share that with you is that if you're not already a listener to Basket Case Clubs, that's where we get raw. So Steve and I talk about all of the things that make clubs basket cases, but most importantly, what they can do to turn things around. So it gets pretty raw, but I think that if there's a nerve, we need to poke it. If there's a loose thread, we need to pull it. Because our goal and why we exist at CPR Group is to help people like you in community organisations, in clubs, in councils, in student organisations, in businesses, to be able to do your job, to be able to deliver on your purpose, deliver your passion for your customers and your community. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We have a range of webinars coming up. Pop into our website and have a look at those, and obviously connect with us on LinkedIn as well. I'll just have a look if there are any more questions that have come in. Not yet. Fantastic. So hang around. If there's any more questions that you want to pop in there, do so, and we'll get back in touch with you. If there's anything else that we can help you with, of course, jump onto our website and contact us there. Until next time, stay safe, have fun, and keep doing what you do best. See you, everyone.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record, being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.